Yo, my name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse. Hello. I'm back again. This is episode 3 of En Masse. Sorry it took a bit of time. There's been a lot of stuff happening with me. Life changes, new jobs, things like that happen. So I've just been transitioning and things have been really busy in the past little bit. The format for this episode will be a little different. Instead of having a guest, I'll be the one talking the entire time. So hopefully you don't get too tired of me, but I think it's good to switch it up every now and again. And so I chose to be the main host for this episode. And I think it's important that obviously you know my views and my opinions on things so that I can engage with people directly, which I think creates interesting discussions and new concepts and things like that can come up. Anyways, I've had a lot of debates and discussions recently in regards to questions of Black liberation and basically wanted to outline some of my thoughts on the question. It's evident that, like within any other group of oppressed people, that there are different opinions and interests involved. Similarly to what you heard in the previous episode on the question of indigenous liberation, there's no small number of methods and approaches within the Black community similarly. There's a vast mixture of views lying on the entire political spectrum. So I wanted to outline some of these as best as possible just to open up a discussion that I think is vital. For today, though, I'll be talking about Black liberalism in particular and how not only Black liberals themselves view liberation, but also how non-Black people that are liberals understand Black liberation and how they think it should happen or whether they think it should happen at all. In order to do this, I'm going to take a look at the movie Black Panther, which just came out. And I'm doing this because, there was a lot of hype. There's still a lot of hype going on about it, how much money it's making in the box office, all this stuff. So I'm going to basically try to unpack this as best as I can. All right. In order to begin making this analysis, I wanted to make it clear that I consider liberalism and all of its contradictions to be the dominant ideology within capitalism. This obviously takes different forms in different countries and under different circumstances, but I think it's important to note. This is not to diminish the role of the conservative tradition under capitalism and, reactionary politics and fascism and things like that as well. But this is going to be the focus for today. There's certainly a relationship between the different modes of thought. Even within liberalism, there's contradictions. Within conservatism, there's contradictions. So I'm just giving a partial or an analysis as best as I possibly can and focusing on the question of liberation in particular. So with that in mind, I wanted to look at a recent event in the promotion and release of the movie Black Panther in order to help guide my explanation of this ideology. First off, the promotion of this movie had been mentioned in the media for, over the course of a few years. Many people were excited, given that, there are few Hollywood movies where the cast is made up of mostly Black people. Usually when these movies do come out, they're usually placed in, the Black movies category if there's going to be a lot of Black actors in it or Black actresses. And thus, these movies are usually like pigeonholed from the gate and don't get the exposure that white movies tend to get. Majority of movies in Hollywood are white, things like that. Anyways, at first glance, many people saw this as a progressive or possibly even revolutionary event occurring in Hollywood, thus representing a general shift in this white supremacist society. This even had me raising a few eyebrows, even though I was already very skeptical as to what the film would bear. For those that don't know, the film is about a fictional country called Wakanda that is hidden from the rest of the world and is the most technologically advanced country in the world, hidden in plain sight. This country is a patriarchal monarchy wherein different tribes can challenge the king for the throne by choosing a fighter of their liking to fight the king one-on-one in hand-to-hand combat. And from what was actually displayed in the movie, it's usually whoever is the king of or the leader of that particular tribe will be the one to try to fight the king for the throne. With this in mind, I wanted to point out that a fundamental aspect of Black liberalism is a yearning for recognition from their dominators. I've seen many Black people, when referring to the poverty in Africa, be very angry with the fact that people see Africa as a poor nation filled with jungles, animals, and no infrastructure. On the one end, it's certainly true that white supremacy infantilizes African people and sees us as inferior in all regards. But on the other end, they defend themselves by saying, like, look, Africa has many cities with high rises and roads. We're just like you guys. And that's basically what they argue. But what this sort of defense does is that it actually reinforces the standards of white supremacy and capitalism, i.e., a society is not human enough or is savage unless they're developed to the degree that Western European capitalist society is developed. What this does is that it completely negates the harshness of the colonial and neo-colonial rule inflicted upon African people to this day, thus reinforcing racism under the guise of defending itself against it. Now, it should also be noted that liberalism, being an ideology based on class power and class oppression, tends not to care about class oppression itself unless it's of a social democratic bent, and even then it always fails to grasp the fundamental contradictions and attempts to reconcile the classes, and doesn't understand that classes can never really be reconciled since they're based in the exploitation and oppression of the lower classes. Whether that class be workers, peasants, slaves, etc., doesn't really matter. Although the movie doesn't go into detail in regards to, labor relations within Wakanda, it's important to note that in one of the epic versions of the original Black Panther comic, which is called Panther's Rage, there are revolutionary sentiments brewing within Wakanda, and the king, whose name is T'Challa, attempts to crush it. I haven't read it yet fully, but that's an important note since Wakanda is a monarchy, therefore some form of class oppression, even within Wakanda, should be assumed. But obviously, since this is a Hollywood film written by liberals, they see no problem with class society, especially one that is technologically advanced and up to capitalist, white supremacist standards of acceptance. I think that the parallel of this in real life would be Saudi Arabia. For example, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy and quote-unquote brutal regime, so on and so forth, but Western imperialism is fine with its existence for as long as it's capitulating to Western imperialism and selling its oil or whatever to Western imperialism on their terms. Thus, they're able to ignore the fact that it's a monarchy, but the second that they would go against Western imperialism, I'm certain that they would use that as justification for why they would want to invade or bomb or sanction Saudi Arabia. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, the entire film never looks at the life of a single average Wakandan and is solely focused on the king and the royal family. Literally, like, every character is a king, a princess, or a aristocrat, or whatever. The comic seems to raise this question a little bit, even the more recent issues, but for this, we will be focusing on the movie. For my next point, I wanted to focus on Wakanda's isolation, which is resolved towards the end of the movie in a very liberal way, and I'll talk about that later. And basically, I wanted to ask the question, like, how is it possible that a society this advanced witnessed the Atlantic slave trade, the brutal colonization of Africa by Europe, and yet did nothing to assist the rest of Africa, yet instead remained isolated and hidden? One explanation would be that Africa wasn't really Africa in that sense, and that we understand it today. It's only with the rise of, nation states and colonization that Africa really began to be known as a thing by Africans. Most Africans were more focused on the well-being of their tribe and identified with their local kingdoms or chiefdoms, unless they were a part of hunter-gatherer societies, but those were usually very small. Therefore, Wakanda, focusing on Wakandans, might not have cared too much about what was happening to everybody else, even though they quote-unquote looked like them. It's true that Africa already had class oppression before the arrival of Europeans. There were many different forms of slavery and the like, and different classes and class distinctions, semi-feudal, societies and things like that. So, although the Atlantic slave trade was definitely, it certainly was unprecedented and exploited those contradictions on a scale unseen ever before in history. With this in mind, my second point is that Wakanda considered itself to be superior to the rest of Africa. Although there's one scene where the princess called the one CIA operative a quote-unquote colonizer, which is funny given that he ends up being their ally to crush the villain, Killmonger. There was one part that I found particularly telling. During a car chase scene in Hong Kong, I believe, one of the Wakandan warriors, while being shot at by guns, refers to the weapons as primitive. This is supposed to be seen as some sort of funny joke, but it exposes the opinions of the liberal writers in a very stark way. What I mean is that if automatic weapons and machinery is considered primitive in relation to Wakandan weapons, then what do Wakandans think about the rest of Africa, which is even less developed than the West? This corroborates my view that at the root of Black liberalism is the acceptance of a capitalist and white supremacist standard of what is considered acceptable or human. There's also another parallel in that the way in which the princess was able to call the CIA operative a colonizer, but still ultimately work with him. And this is something I think that's inherent in liberalism, is the fact that even when something is more overtly reactionary or conservative, that, you know, in words they'll disagree with it, but on a fundamental level, they agree, in the sense that even if they disagree with certain aspects of, you know, let's say Trump's reactionary or conservative, overtly racist sentiments, that the problem with liberalism is that it itself still holds on to a lot of those same sentiments and those same racist ideas. It still accepts that which it claims to be against, and therefore still ultimately is able to work with conservatism and be linked in arms with it. And that's just the way that it is, because they're both general manifestations of capitalist society ideologically and politically, is the liberal conservative split. And in most countries, that's what you see all over the world where capitalism is particularly dominant. Therefore, Wakanda's isolation can be explained in this manner. Another explanation which they bring up in the movie to a certain extent is that they say that, due to fear of being colonized themselves, that's why they chose to be, you know, isolated from the rest of the world. But I think that's kind of, you know, BS, given that, you know, if they're the most technologically advanced society in the world, then the guns they had versus the guns that were used by the Europeans would have been way more advanced. Thus, it probably would have been pretty easy for them, at least to some degree, to defend most of Africa from being colonized and destroyed. Not only that, but it's also pretty apparent in the movie that the King T'Challa knew the CIA operative before they even, you know, encountered one another in the movie. Therefore, it's obvious that even though they were isolationists, that they had some relationship with like imperialist powers, and they were also involved in the UN and things like that. So obviously they weren't clearly isolationist, and they had some interactions with imperialist powers and were clearly okay with the CIA in a sense. And that was pointed out to me by my partner, actually. Wakanda's isolation can be explained in this manner. They had no reason to identify with the rest of Africans, since everyone else was primitive and thus inferior, regardless of the act that they looked like them. This is important given that Black liberalism loves to focus so much on physical appearance of people as being an important factor. For example, we should love Obama, Michelle Obama, and their kids because they look like Black people and because they're powerful and successful and rich, while ignoring the fact that he was an imperialist president like all other American presidents have to be, and is thus a representative of the racist, capitalist, imperialist system that is the root of Black oppression. So again, I'll emphasize that at the root of this ideology is an identification with and reinforcing of the power structure, even when it seems to be radically critical of that structure. It actually isn't at all. It wants to be accepted by it more than anything. Interestingly, the Twitter page at USBLM, which is one of the Black Lives Matter Twitter pages, has celebrated Obama many times and is the embodiment of what I'm expressing here. And this is not to suggest that every single BLM activist supports that page, because I'm aware that there's some different BLM organizations. There's like the BLM network, which is different from like just hashtag BLM, which is just like a general movement. So things are very sporadic. I understand that, but it's very telling. It says something, and there's clearly a lot of people like DeRay McKesson and things like that that are clearly super opportunist and super, you know, and just capitulating to the system to like egregious levels. This problem within Black liberalism also is why it cannot account for really why slavery, at least the Atlantic slave trade, occurred and why it happened. It can't account for the fact that there were internal contradictions within Africa itself that were exploited by the European powers. And some people like to think that, suggesting that, oh, there was slavery in Africa before means that you're justifying the fact that Europeans enslaved Africans to a higher degree. But I think that that's childish and ridiculous. It's one thing to argue that in order to justify it, like conservatives or reactionary people do. Another thing to have a concrete analysis to understand that it wouldn't have been as easy, or it wouldn't have happened in the same way if those social relations did not exist to a certain extent. And I also do understand that 100% that in all cases it wasn't chattel slavery. It might have been a different kind of caste system and things like that, but certainly things that weren't great, or aren't great. So, I mean, we can't ignore those material conditions and internal class contradictions that existed within Africa beforehand in order to just make a defense, in a liberal way, and not actually have a concrete analysis of what happened and what needs to happen for the future also. This is also partially why liberalism hasn't been able to truly tackle the race question, because it can never really ground it in anything concrete. It talks about it in terms of, white people just naturally hate black people, so they just went to Africa, saw them, thought they were lesser than them, like, hey, we just want to enslave these people because we want to benefit off of them. It's not an analysis, it's not concrete. And without that concrete analysis, you never know how to deal with that problem. And this is interesting because it leads into questions of black self-determination within America and in the world in general and at large. So this is why liberalism has never come to that conclusion, because it never had that concrete analysis to understand that all colonized people need self-determination in order to free themselves from the yoke of imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, etc., etc. And anytime it does come anywhere near close to the idea of black self-determination, it does it in a very idealistic way. This movie is a good example because Wakanda is a fictional place. It's not a real place, but yet people are, all over social media calling themselves Wakandan now because they want to associate themselves with something that's capitalistic or developed, and all of these things that people are not critiquing enough, or all these things that are exactly what America looks like or wants to look like, and all these kind of things. So it's like we have to have that analysis. Interestingly enough, like if you think of Garveyism, which I'll be talking about a little bit after, is that there is this kind of idea of black nationalism and black self-determination, but it leads to a lot of sometimes even reactionary politics. It was different with Garveyism. I won't ascribe that to black liberalism, but there's certainly some parallels in terms of that idealism of wanting to escape or wanting to have your own thing, but not really taking into account the state and questions of the state and questions of revolution. So it's like people want their spaces and their enclaves and their houses where it's just them and their friends and things like that. But then it's like you step outside into society and you still have to deal with that racism. You still have to deal with all that stuff because you're not dealing with the state. You're not dealing with, the media apparatus. You're not dealing with all these things that have hegemony over you and over the entire system. And because of that, these ideas continue to perpetuate themselves. Now, moving forward, the story of the villain in the movie is of utmost importance. The name of the villain is Eric Killmonger, which is pretty telling in regards to how the writers wanted us to view this character. And he had like scars all over his body, and he was just like some bloodthirsty killer that just killed everybody. Apparently he like worked with the CIA, which is funny because the CIA is like considered to be the good guys in the film. But throughout the entire movie, he's basically a bloodthirsty villain who's out for revenge due to the fact that his father, who is T'Challa's uncle, thus making Eric T'Challa's cousin, was murdered by T'Challa's father, who was the king at the time. So T'Challa's father killed Eric's father, simply. Eric's father, who had a mission, some sort of secret, spying mission in the real world outside of Wakanda, within the ghettos and slums of Oakland in America, wanted to liberate black people worldwide because he saw the oppression they faced and felt that Wakanda should liberate them since they're black too. This is interesting because he actually lived among the black diaspora and understood the weight of the oppression that black people faced, while the other Wakandans did not. Anyways, based on this backstory, Killmonger planned to somehow take over the Wakandan throne in order to complete his mission of black liberation. Unfortunately, though, the liberal writers made it clear that Killmonger simply wanted black people to dominate the rest of the world through blind rage and to be the king of the planet. This was clear throughout the entire movie. This depiction of, a liberatory cause in relation to Wakanda's isolation and opportunism, and the opportunism is clear in, working with the CIA, ignoring the plight of Africans, etc., is of utmost importance since this is actually how liberals view revolutionary perspectives, especially if any violence whatsoever is going to be involved. The conversation of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King Jr. is often portrayed in this light. They say Malcolm was wrong even though his intentions were right, or like from a right place, his heart was in the right place, but he just was wrong because he wanted violence and guns and things like that. But they say that MLK or Martin Luther King was right because he was nonviolent, he loved Gandhi, even though the civil rights movement was a complete failure since both MLK and Malcolm were assassinated. And there were so many black riots that followed, not to mention the formation of the Black Panther Party in subsequent years, the fact that there was all this anger and rage at the fact that the civil rights movement was a failure. It was not helping anybody and it did not help anybody. To take an aside, my point here is not to criticize the characters in the movie since they're all fictional characters and not real people, but instead to criticize the people that made the movie since all art and media is created for propaganda purposes, including this podcast. Therefore, I'm criticizing the motives and ideology behind the characters. I wanted to emphasize this since I've seen so many articles treating the characters as if they were real people and treating these countries as if they were real. And sometimes I get that as a rhetorical way to understand underlying ideas and ideologies, but I just wanted to emphasize that. Anyway, to go back to Killmonger, what's funny is that throughout the entire movie, the writers made sure that he commits random acts of violence towards women especially. He kills one woman that worked for him for no apparent reason. And it's funny because I've actually seen some liberal people that love identity politics say that Killmonger's liberation was bad because he hurt women both inside and outside of Wakanda, ignoring the fact that Killmonger is not a real person, like I just said, like I mentioned above, and the writers deliberately made his character violent towards women and attached it to a more revolutionary or liberation cause, a revolutionary cause. Therefore, you can make the connection that, oh, everybody that's revolutionary is some crazy misogynist out to kill women or something like that. The most disgusting aspect of this critique is that it ignores the violence faced by all the African women during the Atlantic slave trade, colonization, and their general oppression that's still ongoing throughout the world. To elaborate on this further, the movie did a great job of black liberal identity politics. You had an all-black cast, intelligent and powerful black women, etc., etc., and I've seen many people celebrating this as if it's so great in itself, but somehow this so-called intersectional approach ignores that those women were part of a royal class that collaborated with US imperialism to oppress the vast majority of the global population, the majority of which being women of oppressed nationalities. Anyways, long story short, Killmonger takes over the throne by beating T'Challa in hand-to-hand combat. T'Challa saves the day, kills Killmonger, and then what happens next is pretty crucial. During this entire movie, the king, T'Challa, obviously loves his kingdom, and his father, who was the previous king who was assassinated at the beginning of the movie. After he finds out that his father killed his uncle for going against the king's orders and attempting to liberate black people, he begins to question what it means to be king and the legitimacy of Wakanda's isolation. Therefore, he partially ends up agreeing with the fact that black people worldwide should be assisted in some way by Wakanda. but he disagrees with Killmonger's methods, and this is a crucial part of Black liberalism, or a liberal understanding of Black oppression and how we should seek liberation. They tend to accept that we are oppressed and not liberated, so, they agree with some of the premises underlying revolutionary thought, but their attachment to the system is strong enough that they can't denounce the entire thing. Therefore, they want to achieve liberation the quote-unquote right way, thus accepting nonviolence as some sort of eternal truth that should be upheld no matter what, attempting to reform a system that continues to spit in their face. And these are the dynamics at play here and within Black liberalism in general. Sometimes this approach pretends to be radical, but that's an analysis I'll save for the future. Anyways, the movie ends with T'Challa being king again, but with an alteration to Wakanda's foreign policy. Instead of being isolationist, they choose to tell the world about their miracle mineral, which was called vibranium, and is the reason as to why they were so developed. And they also create a science outreach center in Oakland, which is very telling. Because my question is, how in the world is a science outreach center going to liberate anybody, any Black person? Where in history or in the history of the entire world has any NGO organization liberated an entire people? And the answer is never, clearly. The movement towards liberation has only come via political struggle that usually involved a certain degree of violence most of the time. And this is no small point. But this movie and its writers want us to think otherwise. To make things worse, now we have Black liberals coming out of the woodworks talking about how this movie is so progressive, how it's making so much money in the box office on the sole fact that the cast is mostly Black. This is childish and completely void of any concrete analysis. But what more can we expect from liberalism? Liberalism always has this view that revolutionary movements have a point, quote unquote, but if only they turn it down a notch, then everything would be nice and dandy. It can never account for the reality that the world itself is so corrupt with its racism, capitalism, and imperialism. Like, the world is already violent. So when people react and organize against that violence and defend themselves against that violence, that is correct and not incorrect, because the world is already like this. That's the point of revolutionary movements. But anyways, the point is to say that, revolutionary movements are basically the only thing that really ever bring us closer to new conditions that can actually be better, since it alters the fundamental basis of society, aiming to alter social relations in general. Whereas liberalism thinks, things need to be tweaked a little bit, but that things are as best as they can be, since it's usually revolutionary movements and the fear of the ruling class of revolutionary movements that have driven even the reforms that liberals claim to be the champions of. So most of the time, it's those revolutionary movements that are really the driving force and what scares the ruling class, because they understand that this actually has the potential to end things as they currently are. Unsurprisingly, the film was partly inspired by the revival of the Black Panther comic by writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is probably the worst kind of neoliberal pundit. He recently wrote a book where he compared Obama with Malcolm X, which is insanely ridiculous when you consider the politics of it. And this was called out by Cornel West, actually. What my argument is in regards to the recent surge of Black movies in Hollywood is that there's a growing rift between Black proletarians and the Black bourgeois or Black capitalist class. There are more Black capitalists making their way into positions of power, and Obama's presidency is another sign of this. Therefore, what we're seeing is a Black bourgeois renaissance that has nothing to do with Black liberation in general. But Black liberalism conflates the two. It sees the success of a few more Black people as Black liberation, instead of the liberation of the majority of Black people that are part of the proletarian working class as liberation. This is the fundamental difference between Black liberalism and Black communism, or Black revolutionary thought or radical thought. The latter being what I espouse. It isn't surprising that rich Black people such as Oprah Winfrey, John Legend, Beyonce, and Jay-Z have supported the Democratic Party through and through, given their role within the ruling class. They claim to care about the well-being of the Black masses, and it's possible that maybe a little part of them does, but their actions of endorsing the Democratic Party and liberalism makes their actions futile, since they represent the system and will never be able to question it on a fundamental level. And this is the biggest point. It's like once they themselves have become owners of capital and the movers of money, then it makes sense that there's going to be certain blind spots, right? Because in order to espouse a more communistic, revolutionary situation, you would have to give up what you have as an individual, free person and, under a capitalist system. So that's an important point. If you want to follow En Masse, go to enmasspodcast.com. You can find us on Patreon, SoundCloud, Google Play, iTunes, TuneIn, basically most podcast websites. So moving on, I wanted to discuss a little debate that I got into recently with some members of the African People's Socialist Party, since it relates to this general topic of Black liberation, Black liberalism, etc. So the APSP, or African People's Socialist Party, is a group I've been following for years because when I first got into politics, I was interested in seeing how Black and African people interpreted and incorporated communism into the politics of Black liberation. The APSP piqued my interest since one of their members, Gazi Kozdo, had been making some pretty entertaining videos on Facebook critiquing racism in America. Shortly after following his posts for a time, I started to question and feel uncomfortable with some of their stances and politics, but never really analyzed concretely what those problems were. A few years passed, and Gazi posted something wherein he was basically claiming that Marxism-Leninism was for white people and separated the APSP's politics from this tradition. I found it ridiculous given that a lot of African countries that were directly Marxist-Leninist, or at least influenced by it, used Marxism-Leninism to a certain extent to gain a certain degree of independence from their former colonizers. It certainly didn't end it, since neo-colonialism quickly replaced classic colonialism, but it was obviously powerful and progressive in its time. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and even Mandela were influenced by this. It certainly had its limits and faults, but to ignore its contribution I felt was ahistorical and an incorrect view. With that said, moving on, the more I analyzed their work, the more I realized that they upheld Marcus Garvey, or Garveyism, as a legitimate basis for their understanding of Black liberation. This reality lit a light bulb in my head, since I remember reading different views and opinions in regards to Marcus Garvey from prominent Black communists and socialists in the early 20th century. Among some of these were Phillip Randolph, Cyril Briggs, and Harry Haywood. Randolph was part of the Socialist Party and so had the view that the question of race is purely a question of class, and this was a largely held view in the Socialist Party, and to some extent the Communist Party, which later on split from the Socialist Party and was more radical. This view was class reductionist and incorrect in that it reduced race to class without taking into account the concrete history of African Americans and their relationship to labor and their colonized status. Cyril Briggs, on the other hand, supported Marcus Garvey's movement and even defended him from critiques via his publication, The Crusader. Briggs was also the founder of the African Blood Brotherhood, which advocated for the self-determination of Blacks and self-defense of Black communities via the use of arms, and was a semi-underground organization. This organization was also explicitly Marxist and supported the Bolshevik Revolution. After a number of African Blood Brotherhood members attended one of the Universal Negro Improvement Association conventions, which was the name of Garvey's organization, and for short I'll call it the UNIA, they were expelled from that meeting for supporting the Bolshevik Revolution and for being critical of the UNIA, and this was the breaking point between the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, and Cyril Briggs and the African Blood Brotherhood. Another thing to note is that this UNIA convention in New York, 1921, the ABB and Briggs also emphasized the failures of Garveyism since they took the position of critical support for the UNIA. After critiquing Garvey for contradictorily suggesting that Black people should remain loyal to the colonial states in which they lived under, and for not critiquing capitalism, they were kicked out of that convention. There was also a personal beef between Briggs and Garvey because Garvey claimed, after what happened at the convention, that Briggs was a white man pretending to be Black due to his being mixed race and having a light complexion. This is telling because Garvey was an advocate for racial purity and the idea that whites and blacks shouldn't mix since it reflected previous social relations under slavery. Therefore, he had no class analysis in practice and saw the entire question of race in isolation from any other dynamics. This made him a sort of race reductionist in opposition to A. Phillip Randolph's class reductionism, which, as I noted, is also incorrect. Race reductionism is also reflected in a liberal understanding of the race question, like I noted in the discussion about Black Panther. Everything is reduced to being about skin color and physical features, etc., instead of like a historical materialist approach. It basically accepts certain white supremacist ideas about physical appearance being an indication of intelligence or savagery and attempts to flip it on its head. In that sense, putting black people at the top because of their physical features, as opposed to white people being at the bottom because of their, natural abilities or their natural inclination to certain kinds of activity. I've also seen many APSP members refer to Europeans as cave people and the like because of this ideology. Briggs later took Garvey to court on account of these accusations pertaining to Briggs' race, and Garvey lost the case, being compelled to a public apology for these particular statements. Interestingly enough, during the trial, Garvey gave the judge a letter he received from Briggs which discussed the reality of revolutionary black liberation and the overthrow of the state being a necessity, in an attempt to snitch on Briggs, but this failed. So basically, yeah, he gave the judge a letter to be like, hey, this guy is trying to overthrow the American government. Shouldn't we do something about it? In an attempt to, I don't know what he was trying to do, but anyway. I want to make sure to emphasize that Garvey was always deeply fearful of the state and distanced himself from socialism, communism, and radicalism for this reason. He even distanced himself from A. Phillip Randolph, who was an opportunist and a reformist social democrat, partially for this very reason. Although Garvey's movement certainly had support from the black masses, including workers, it was actually politically driven by black petty bourgeois interests and a class of disgruntled black professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc. This is evident in that Garvey espoused capitalism and had no problem with it. When Africans started flocking to the industrial centers to find work, like in Chicago and New York, in the north of the United States, they were often forced to sell their labor for cheap, cheaper than white workers, thus putting them in the role of strikebreakers a lot of the time, alongside some immigrant populations. On top of this, unions like the American Federation of Labor were extremely reactionary and racist, so they chose not to allow black people into their unions. Because of this, Garvey stated that the white capitalists were the friends of the black laborer, which was ridiculous and drives home the point I'm trying to make here. Within my argument with members of the African People's Socialist Party, I made all of these facts apparent to them, but they attempted to conflate all critiques of Garvey with that of black liberals and social democrats like A. Phillip Randolph and W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the liberal NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. On the contrary, my critique was coming from Cyril Briggs and Harry Haywood, who were both members of the African Blood Brotherhood, founded in 1919, and they later joined the Communist Party of the USA when they were still actually communist. Interestingly, both were kicked out of the party later on during its popular front phase in the 30s and 40s, and Harry Haywood went on to be a very influential figure in the anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist movement, which influenced the new communist movement, which included the Black Panther Party, when it began to take shape as Mao Zedong thought in the 60s and 70s. Briggs and many of the black members were accused of being black nationalists by the CPUSA because they understood the necessity of seeing black people as a nation that should have their own right to self-determination. It's clear to see how this was later picked up by the Black Panther Party. Haywood and Briggs spent a lot of time in the early years of the CPUSA combating white chauvinism within the party and outside of the party, sometimes making some great successes, sometimes failures. You can read their book Black Bolshevik to see some of these experiences. Haywood in particular also had to combat other comrades, other black comrades in particular, in getting them to see the validity of black people being a nation within America, which touches on the idea that, just because someone's black, it doesn't mean that they all agree on the same exact topic or the exact methods that should be used for liberation, right? You have your Martin Luther Kings, Malcolm X, Harry Haywood, Garvey, all these people with very different views in terms of how we should approach the question of liberation. Anyways, without delving too much into the history there, my general goal is to compare Harry Haywood's approach to that of Marcus Garvey. A thing to note here is that a large segment of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union endorsed Harry Haywood's theories and were part of its development when he went there to study in the 1920s. Marcus Garvey's movement certainly had an influence on Haywood since it was the first black nationalist movement of this size, and it was really popular in the Caribbean and in the US among many black people. It emphasized notions of black pride, tradition, and was positive in this respect, and that shouldn't be underestimated. Haywood also points this out. However, the petty bourgeois reactionary side of the movement was certainly apparent. Aside from the odd cultish references of Garvey being Black Moses and President of Africa, which is pretty ridiculous, according to the UNIA, Garvey had a secret meeting with the KKK and said, "I regard the Klan, the Anglo-Saxon clubs, and white American societies, as far as the Negro is concerned, as better friends of the race than all other groups of hypocritical whites put together." Close quote. On the one end, it's certainly true that there were hypocritical whites, in the labor movement, leftist movements, liberals, whatever, and elsewhere. But to suggest that this means that the KKK were the friends of black people is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And he did the same thing with the relationship between black people and the white capitalists and said that the white capitalist was the friends of black people in order to get back at the white labor, racist labor movement at the time, which is also ridiculous. Instead of saying, maybe black people should form their own unions, he, espoused something completely reactionary and pro-capitalist and espoused the exploitation of his own people. But anyways, yeah, that's pretty ridiculous. Especially when this was when lynching and attacks on black people were still happening and the KKK was leading out these attacks. It's easy to see this on the surface and denounce Marcus Garvey, which I'm certainly not opposed to, but it's important to see the theoretical underpinnings and material conditions that influence these actions. On top of this, Garvey also espoused what was known as the Back to Africa movement, where he theorized that black people should all go back to Africa in order to maintain the purity of the race and build an empire back home, since they weren't, appreciated in the West or appreciated even in the Caribbean, I guess. It's easy to see how a class of petty bourgeois-minded black shop owners, doctors, lawyers, etc. would have found this attractive when they were educated but still barred from living a comfortable life due to the racism in America. So it's easy to see how that would fuel this idealistic plan to go back to Africa. There's also a parallel between this mode of thinking and the idealism we see around the Black Panther movie, both of which being linked to a crass understanding of race relations and an inability to ground the reality of black oppression to concrete historical conditions, thus being incapable of leading to a more revolutionary goal, like the self-determination of blacks in America, where they actually are and realistically would end up staying. With Haywood, what he took from Garvey was, yes, we need some sense of understanding that there is a black nation and it's a global black nation. But even if you simply just looked at the population of blacks in America, that they constituted their own nation because they had, their own culture, their own languages, their own belief systems, their own history that was very particular. And with that said, he took that aspect of Garveyism, but then grounded it in a concrete Marxist analysis and recognized that black people need self-determination for where they are. Given that black people had been in America for over 400 years at that point, it made sense that they would consider where they were to be their home, since that's where they lived for all those years. So that was the big difference between Garvey and Harry Haywood. Comparing Haywood's perspective to that of A. Phillip Randolph's, it's obvious that Haywood was sort of like the middle ground between what Marcus Garvey espoused and what A. Phillip Randolph espoused. Randolph focusing solely on class instead of focusing on the question of black determination. He only focused on the question of black rights, trying to get the rights of black people and fight for those rights through the institutions that were already in place. Whereas Haywood understood that those institutions are fundamentally racist and therefore will never actually lead to any form of black liberation and the question of rights cannot be given by a system that is not built or was not built for black people or by black people in America in particular, and even globally. In regards to practice and Phillip Randolph, Phillip Randolph kind of tailed the civil rights movement for this reason, due to the theoretical or his theoretical understanding of how black people should seek liberation. He ended up tailing, Martin Luther King and all these other people, which is why most people don't even know Phillip Randolph unless you really study the history of black socialism and communism. So it's telling that, and this is very common with, Trotskyist organizations, and where they just end up tailing social democratic movements and those kind of movements under the guise of saying that, this is where the working class is, so we're going to try to enter their institutions and try to antagonize people, but it clearly doesn't work. It's also easy to see how a lack of a Marxist analysis and an acceptance of capitalism would lead to these conclusions when linked with the abhorrent racism present in the world that is directed towards black people. It's also important to note that many black workers had migrated to the North and were thus part of a process of proletarianization and were inexperienced in this regard in terms of their relationship with capitalism was very new. So all they knew was, being black and being oppressed. So it makes sense that you would be attached to Garveyism and the UNIA when they're talking about black pride and things that you never really encountered before, because you had a whole history of slavery, and the American system was telling you that your entire history began with slavery, whereas Garvey was saying, no, in Africa we had our own civilizations and our own organizations and our own traditions, which was, like I said, some of the positive aspects. Now, to go back to the APSP and their practices in relation to what I've iterated, they've also adopted a lot of these problems, but color them with socialist rhetoric. For example, they have what's called Black Star Industries, which is a collective of small black businesses that they run or support. Garvey and the UNIA, in comparison, also super emphasized the owning of small black businesses, and even had a ship, which was called the Black Star Line, and did some minimal trading with Liberia. And Black Star Industries is directly influenced by the creation and existence of Black Star Line. On top of that, they always overemphasize the selling of their newspaper, which is called the Burning Spear. This is the APSP I'm talking about. And on top of that, they have a subsidiary organization for their white supporters, where they try to run this guy named Jesse Neville for mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, on a reparations platform. What all of these different aims and goals have in common are the fact that they're money-making ventures. This is not to say that revolutionary organizations should never try to raise money or sell anything. That would be a ridiculous assertion. But it's one thing to raise money for a revolutionary movement and another to base your organization on the idea of building economic dual power, which is what Garvey wanted to do, but in Africa mainly. To overemphasize making money and being a dual economy, or a contending economy when you're in the center of the most capitalist country in the world, is to shoot yourself in the foot. This economism, as I'll call it here, is what many organizations that uphold Garvey attempts to do. Many of them are what people call Hotep organizations, because they usually are organizations that like to express an affiliation to African kingdoms and Egypt without really a concrete analysis of understanding the historical material conditions of the existence of those kingdoms and whether they were even good for the majority of people that lived in those kingdoms. But anyway, so the APSP is different from Marcus Garvey because they try to seek the liberation of black people in America as opposed to in Africa, but they still are attached to a kind of cultish mentality in regards to their leader, Omali Yeshitali, and also the kind of economism that I'm talking about, where you're so focused on gaining economic power that you're not really taking into account the dynamics of the state and things like that. They think that, you're going to raise all this money and get rich and have all these dominant bases solely on economic ventures. Then once you have that, then that'll lead to the political and other aspects. But I think that's incorrect. And I think it's based on a very crude understanding of the relationship between the economic base and the superstructure, and thinking that the economic base and having somewhat of economic power simply through earning money, which is also a very limited understanding of what the economic base is, will simply lead to the domination of the superstructure at some point in the future. And that's wrong, as I've just said. There's socialist language sprinkled on top of what are simply petty bourgeois and social democratic practices. I wouldn't be against a movement fighting for reparations, for example, but only if that movement or organization was revolutionary and had a concrete Marxist analysis, which is clearly lacking here. I mean, even if Jesse Neville became mayor, how would reparations be obtained from a mayoral position? Smells like opportunism to me. Like you're just trying to claim that maybe you want to antagonize the people, you know, knowing that you won't win. And even if you would win, how would you even get reparations for all of Black people in America or elsewhere through a mayoral position? It doesn't make any sense. I've even had a few people try to argue to me that the Black Panther Party was an exceptional example of the success of this kind of economistic approach. But the problem here is that you can't conflate the two things, because for the Black Panther Party, what they did was antagonize small businesses in order to run their free breakfast programs. So they were getting free donations. And if a business did not donate to them, then they would protest or antagonize that business and make them do it, or, you know, call them the enemies of the people, things like that, in order to get free things to provide for people. And most of their services were free, majority. The health clinics, the breakfast programs, they even would drive children to school. And if they did charge for anything, it was extremely cheap. So what they did was subjugate the economic aspect to the political aspect and worked with the two in conjunction, and didn't just say, oh, we only need an economic liberation, and that's the only thing that's going to lead to our liberation. And I think that's the fundamental difference between the two, is that you have to look at the economic base in relationship to the ideological, the political, and not just have this idea that once you have economic liberation, all of a sudden you're going to be liberated and free. And I think that's a crucial aspect, and I'm probably going to end up elaborating on this topic even more as we go in the future. I'm going to talk about Hotepism probably, because that's another big ideological thing that's also influenced by this kind of Garveyism. That's a whole other topic, and for a whole other time. Anyways, I hope, you know, let me know if I did a good job with talking for about an hour or so. And thank you so much for listening to En Masse. I've even had people donating to the Patreon, which I haven't even promoted, which, you know, I really appreciate, because it does help and everything. I've had a lot of suggestions, which I'll be trying to incorporate for the future. I'm going to continue to try to do this monthly. I know this one came a little bit late, but I got a new job and there's been a lot of changes. So I've just been extremely busy. And let me know what you think. If you want to follow En Masse, go to enmasspodcast.com. You can find us on Patreon, SoundCloud, Google Play, iTunes, TuneIn, basically at most podcast websites and aggregate podcast tools. You can find us there. So thank you so much. And my name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse.